Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, AI Developments Industry, Wednesday, July 8. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. Here is a small story that, once you notice it, reorganizes how you read every headline about artificial intelligence this summer. A well-known developer sat down to finish a release of a modest but widely used piece of software, a library for wrangling databases, the sort of thing that runs quietly beneath thousands of projects without anyone thinking about it. He wanted to ship a stable major version, the kind you only get to change once every few years, so getting it right mattered. And so, from his phone, he asked a coding model to do a final review before shipping. The model came back with 5 what it called release blockers, genuine, subtle, data-losing bugs the human author hadn't found himself. One of them left a database connection in a poisoned state where deletions silently never committed. The cost of this exercise in tokens was about $150. Now, the obvious reading of that story is, look, the machines are getting good at programming. True enough, but that is not the interesting part. The interesting part is the shape of the collaboration. The human wasn't typing code and asking the machine to autocomplete. He was setting direction, exercising taste about what a stable release should mean, and delegating judgment, even in a related experiment, instructing the model to decide for itself which cheaper model to use for the humbler subtasks to save money. The human has moved up a level. He is managing, reviewing, deciding, spending. And the thing he is managing is now competent enough to find his own mistakes. That is the cross-cutting insight I want to plant before we go any further. The frontier of this field is no longer really about raw capability. It has quietly become about the relationship between a person and a system that is good enough to be trusted with parts of the work, and the strange new problems that trust creates. Because here is the twist that a casual reader of the news would miss entirely. The better these models get at one specific thing, the worse they can become at another. There's a lovely, telling anecdote from someone building an alternative coding tool who found that the newest, most advanced models from a leading lab were worse at using his tool than their older, dumber predecessors. Why? Because the labs are now training their models intensely to use their own in-house editing tools, and that specialization bleeds. The model has, in effect, developed muscle memory for one particular workshop and become clumsier in anyone else's. Better model, worse tool. Progress is no longer a single arrow pointing up. It is a set of trade-offs, and improvement in the headline benchmark can quietly degrade the thing you actually depend on. Hold that thought, because it rhymes with a deeper anxiety running underneath the whole ecosystem. If the models are being tuned to work best inside the walled gardens of the companies that build them, then the open, interoperable, anyone-can-plug-in character of software is under a subtle kind of pressure, which is precisely why you now see serious money, hundreds of millions, going into efforts to map the open-source AI landscape, to catalog the models and datasets and tools that anyone can inspect and build upon, as a deliberate public alternative to the closed frontier. That project, cataloging hundreds of products across a stack of layers, is really an act of orientation, an attempt to answer the question, where does the open world actually stand, before that world is quietly enclosed. And then there is the human cost, which arrives not as apocalypse, but as a slow leak. A respected creator of programming courses reports his sales down by half or more. 2 reasons, both instructive. People wonder whether developer jobs will even exist soon, so they hesitate to invest in learning. And those who do want to learn increasingly turn to chatbot for personalized tutoring, a chatbot trained, of course, on work like his, offered back to his would-be students without his consent or a penny in compensation. There's the double bind of this moment in miniature. The technology simultaneously suppresses the demand for a skill and appropriates the labor of the people who taught it. So where does the field stand? Not, I'd argue, at the dramatic threshold the headlines imply. It stands at a subtler and more consequential place, the point where these systems have become capable collaborators and the whole game shifts from, can it do the task, to, how do we work alongside it without losing our grip? One of the sharpest framings I've encountered lately is the idea that you must understand in order to participate, that if your grasp of what the machine is building drifts too far from reality, you accumulate a kind of cognitive debt, and your ability to steer the thing quietly evaporates. That is the argument I want to build over the next stretch. First, what these systems can genuinely do now and where the trade-offs bite. Then the tension between the closed frontier and the open commons. And finally, the human question, understanding, participation, and what we owe the people whose work built all of this. Stay with me. There's a small story I keep returning to because it contains almost everything I want to say about the deep current running beneath all the noise of this particular season in artificial intelligence. Developer a careful one, the sort who takes semantic versioning seriously and treats a breaking change in a major release as something close to a moral failing, sits down to ship a stable release of a modest but widely used software library. And before he does, he asks the model to perform a final review. Spot anything, he says, that would hurt us later if we shipped it and had to fix it after. And the model comes back with 5 release blockers. Real ones. The worst of them, a data loss bug hiding in a single method that failed to wrap its work in the proper transaction, a bug that quietly poisoned the database connection so that everything you did afterwards silently refused to save. He hadn't encountered it. His tests hadn't caught it. It was simply there waiting. Now the surface reading of that story is the one everyone reaches for. Look, the machine found the bug, the machines are getting good, jobs are doomed, and so on. But I think the surface reading misses the current entirely, because notice what actually happened. The humans still framed the question. The humans still cared, specifically and deeply, about the thing that mattered, the sanctity of a stable release, the promise you make to the people downstream of your work. The model was extraordinary at finding the flaw. It was the human who knew the flaw was worth finding. That distinction is the deep current. And you can see it echoed everywhere once you learn to look. There's a tip that's circulated among people building with these coding agents that struck me as quietly profound. Don't dictate to the model exactly how to work, they said. Don't tell it precisely when to write tests or which model to run for a given task. Instead, tell it to use its own judgment. Let it decide. That is a remarkable inversion. For 70 years we told machines exactly what to do, step by tedious step, because that was the only language they understood. Now the frontier of getting good work out of them is learning to delegate judgment, and crucially, learning what judgment is worth delegating and what remains stubbornly yours. Because here is the countercurrent, and it matters just as much. Developer working on a coding tool discovered something genuinely strange. The newest, most capable models from a major lab were worse at using his particular editing tool than their older, humbler predecessors. Not because they'd forgotten how to edit, but because they'd been so intensively trained to use one specific tool, baked into one specific harness, that they'd become subtly clumsy with anyone else's. The intelligence got sharper and narrower at the same time, better and worse in the same breath. Tells you these systems are not accumulating some pure transferable competence. They are being shaped deliberately toward particular grooves, and a system shaped toward a groove is a system that has a shape you did not choose. So the deep current is not the machines are taking over the work. It is a redistribution, a migration of where human effort has to live. The mechanical labor, the finding and the drafting and the patient scanning of 2,000 lines drifts toward the model. But the framing, the caring, the deciding what is worth doing and to what standard, that concentrates, and it concentrates in fewer hands doing more consequential things. And this is where I want to point to the thing that unsettles me most. There was a framing I heard recently that I cannot stop turning over, understand to participate. The idea is that when you collaborate with one of these agents on something large, the danger is not that it does bad work. The danger is that your own understanding quietly drifts away from how the thing actually works. You accumulate what one might call cognitive debt, a growing gap between what exists and what you comprehend. And the moment that gap opens too wide, you can no longer meaningfully participate. You can no longer steer or correct or even frame the next question well. You become a spectator to your own project. Set that beside the course maker watching his teaching revenue collapse by half, because learners now turn to a model that has, without consent, absorbed his work and offers it back as personalized tutoring. And you begin to see the shape of the current clearly. It is not simply displacement. It is a hollowing of the middle skill, the middle understanding, the intermediate rungs of the ladder we all once climbed. The machine offers you the top of the ladder for free. It just quietly removes the rungs. So the trend beneath the noise is this. The value is migrating toward judgment, toward the depth of understanding that lets you participate rather than merely watch. And the very tools accelerating that migration are also the ones eroding the ground where that judgment is grown. That is the tension we carry into the final stretch. We've spent this conversation looking at the texture of a particular moment, a developer letting a model hunt for release-blocking bugs before shipping a stable version, another discovering that the newest, most capable models had somehow become worse at using his particular editing tool. Now let me try to draw the threads together and ask what it all means, and more usefully, what you ought to be watching for. Start with that bug. A delete operation that never committed its transaction, quietly poisoning the database connection so that every subsequent write silently vanished. Data loss, the worst kind of quiet catastrophe, and it was a model that found it, sifting through the code with a mandate to spot anything that might become a breaking change too late to fix. The second-order implication here is subtle. We are not simply watching machines write code faster. We are watching them take on the role of the careful, pessimistic reviewer, the colleague who reads your diff and asks the awkward question. That is a different economic proposition entirely. The bottleneck in software has rarely been typing. It has been judgment, review, the catching of the thing you did not think to check. If that faculty becomes cheap and abundant, the shape of the whole craft shifts. Watch for whether review, not authorship, becomes the thing we increasingly delegate. Hold that optimism against the second story, because it is a warning wrapped in a curiosity. Newer models, trained hard to excel at one specific editing tool baked into one specific harness, became measurably worse at using a rival's tool. They invented fields, hallucinated keys that fit the schema they'd been drilled on rather than the one actually in front of them. This is what I'd ask you to watch most carefully of all, the quiet emergence of lock-in through capability itself. Not through contracts or file formats, but through the grain of the model. When a system is trained so intensely to be excellent within one environment that it degrades outside it, you have a new and slippery form of platform gravity. The better the model gets at its home turf, the higher the cost of leaving. Third-party builders may find themselves forced to implement whichever tool the model was trained to love, rather than the one they designed freely. That is the enclosure of a supposedly open capability, happening not by decree, but by reinforcement. And then there is the human cost, which the corpus registers with unusual candor. A course creator watching sales fall by half, partly because learners fear the jobs won't exist, partly because the models themselves now tutor for free, having absorbed that creators work without consent or compensation. This is the double bind of the moment. The very abundance we celebrate erodes the incentive to acquire the understanding that abundance depends upon. Which brings me to the framing I found most durable in all of this: understand to participate. The idea that you must comprehend the code to a depth that lets you remain an active partner, rather than accumulating what one might call cognitive debt, that widening gap between what the system built and what you actually grasp. This is the tension I'd urge you to sit with. If the models get good enough that nobody bothers to learn, we may end up with vast systems that work beautifully until they don't, tended by people who no longer possess the rich set of concepts needed to reason about them. Watch the debt. Watch whether the culture treats understanding as a cost to be eliminated or a capacity to be preserved. There are lighter signals worth tracking too, and they matter more than they seem. A credible world map compressed into roughly 450 bytes, decompressed by a clever browser trick. The relentless pull toward delegation, one model instructed to choose a cheaper, smaller model for the humble tasks, exercising its own judgment about when the expensive brain is warranted. That instinct to let the system allocate its own effort rather than dictating every step is quietly one of the most important shifts. It means we are moving from operators to something more like managers, setting intent and trusting execution. The skill of the coming years may be less about doing and more about specifying well and knowing when to check. So what should you actually watch? 3 things. First, whether review and verification become the durable human contribution as authorship cheapens. Second, whether capability itself becomes a mechanism of lock-in, quietly punishing anyone who builds outside the favored harness. And third, whether we manage to keep our understanding current, whether the institutions of learning, the courses and the mentors, and the slow acquisition of fluency survive an era where the machine will simply do it for you and do it without ever teaching you why. The comfortable story is that these tools make us more capable. The truer story is that they redistribute capability, and where it lands, and who controls the ground it lands on, remains very much unsettled. Keep your eyes there. That's where the next signal will come from. Thank you for listening. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming. We'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.